Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Backer. Welcome to my channel. I am in Kłodzko, Poland right now. It's a very small town on the southern border, and I'm going to make an entire video about my big literary adventure in Europe at some point. So this is not that, just wanted to give you guys some context. But I wandered into a bookstore in Prague that sold books in English, and I saw some Oxford World Classics on a designated shelf, started flipping through a couple of them, and one of them was Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Nietzsche. And I did not intend to buy it until it started to draw me in, and then the person who was working behind the counter told me that the store was closing. And so all of a sudden there was this urgency, and it was starting to catch my interest, and so I bought it. And it turned out to be a bit of a synchronicity. It was exactly what I needed, not only at that phase in my trip, but just at that phase in my life. And in addition to it being an excellent work of literature, it prompted a very cool spiritual investigation for myself that I think for the first half of the book struck me as perfect. And then toward the second half of the book, I became more critical of some of the ideas. And it's funny because when we talk about ambivalent feelings about something or something being bittersweet, a lot of times people think that the bitterness like outweighs the sweet. Like to have any part of the negative aspect of it mentioned means that it was not a pleasant experience overall. But I think that the ambiguity made it an excellent work, that I have mixed feelings about it. And the fact that it's mixed doesn't mean that I don't like it or that my criticisms invalidate the book in any way. Because I could already imagine some Nietzsche people are going to come and watch this video and be like, oh, he actually had answers to all of that in the book. And a lot of my criticisms that I'll get into in the second half of the video, I agree with that. That I have a criticism that he actually built into the book, right? So it certainly doesn't invalidate the book. But that being said, since it is a work of fiction, in addition to being a work of philosophy, there are some soft edges to some of the points that he's making. It's not a dense, rigorous system in the same way that someone like Hegel made, where even though it's very confusing to read Hegel, I think you can be more right and wrong about Hegel than you can about something like Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And at the end of the day, I'm not going to read this book 10 times in order to perfectly understand it. It struck me at a very interesting time, so let's get into it. First of all, the consensus online seems to be that this is maybe the worst place to start with Nietzsche. It's the second book of his that I've read. I read Beyond Good and Evil at a similarly very unexpected but synchronous time in my life, that I had just moved back from Los Angeles. I guess I would have been 25 at the time, 25 or 26. I was in Kansas City, had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, read Beyond Good and Evil, hit me at a really cool time. That being said, even though this is considered one of the more difficult books of Nietzsche's, I went in armed with a lot of concepts that I've picked up from reading almost exclusively German literature in the past 2 years. Some of you might know that I got super into Faust in my first year of teaching, and that inspired me to read a bunch of stuff in the German tradition. So that was super helpful. And specifically, earlier this year, I read Damien by Hermann Hesse, and that is one, very easy to read and to understand, and two, if I'm not mistaken, directly inspired by Nietzsche, if not Thus Spoke Zarathustra specifically. And so if you have tried to read Thus Spoke Zarathustra before and have struggled, and you don't want to do 2 years of reading about the German literary tradition, Damien is short and amazing and easy to understand. And I think it would be a great lead up to Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So, let's kind of get into some of the ideas in this book that I found so inspiring. In the prologue, he begins by coming out of solitude. And that is cool because a lot of philosophy does seem like, oh, isolate yourself in a room and just think about stuff. And it seems like Zarathustra began there, and then he decides to actually try to go engage with the world again. And I found this meaningful on so many levels because my interest in spirituality and the occult and different heady endeavors has earned the criticism from other people that I know, and just ideas and my impression of those ideas, that you're kind of denying the world by being in your head all the time, by being interested in spirituality as if there's some elsewhere that you're supposed to be at, and then the current version of yourself is somehow base or not as real or not as worth paying attention to. And so the book begins there, and he passes a hermit, and the hermit is like, why do you want to go down and hang out with all those dummies down there? You should just be talking to the bears and the bees. And Nietzsche is basically like, he doesn't say this to the hermit's face, but he's like, doesn't he know that God is dead? Which is a very famous line. You know, even people who don't know a ton about Nietzsche know the line, God is dead. And so in this context, it seems to be that, like, if you just isolate yourself and live in spiritual contemplation, you're serving and obeying something rather than going out and actually engaging with the world. And so it seems like it might be a call to atheism, but it's much more about a life-affirming earthly philosophy, and he specifically uses that word earthly throughout the book. And this resonates with my values of spirituality, because the most mystical and spiritual experiences that I've had have come from deep immersion in the world. You know, I've gotten back into meditating on this trip because I met a really cool guy from Colombia in Bratislava, and everybody else would be like hungover because it was a party hostel. And early in the morning, I would like open my eyes and he'd just be sitting on his bunk bed meditating. And so I talked to him a little bit, and I was like, oh yeah, I should get back into that. All of that is to say, even meditation does feel a little removed from the world, but some of the most amazing experiences that I've had that I consider transcendent and spiritual have come from being in community with other people. But that comes with drawbacks. And a point that I've made in videos on TikTok before is that when people advocate for community, it sounds like it's just this wholesome Hallmark card encouragement to go out and just love everybody. But if you ever engaged with community before, you'll know that, like, you don't like everybody in a community. And so shortly after Zarathustra goes down and tries to speak to the people, he realizes that they're just not going to listen to him. And so he quickly realizes, oh, I need companions. I don't need to just have followers and disciples who think I'm excellent. I need people that are also striving to be good. And that's going to be a minority of people. So that is, I think, what is both funny, but then also you could see how somebody could interpret this for bad purposes, or to just think that they're better than everybody else. And again, even though Nietzsche talks a whole lot about people who think that they're just better than everybody else with no good reason, I don't think that's any guarantee that you're going to latch onto that idea and then magically turn into somebody that is both Nietzsche's overhuman, or Übermensch, which I'll talk about in a second, and then also free from the pitfalls of the feelings of superiority and arrogance. So he goes on, and there's a lot of really dense symbolism in the novel, and I guess it's kind of a novel, in the text that is both super fascinating, but then not really the point of this video. I don't want to get into all of the symbolism. He's got stuff about like a rope dancer who represents that humans are like on a midway point between being a beast and the overhuman. He's got an awesome staff, which I think it sucks that they put this band over it, because the staff that I think his followers give him this. I forget who gives it to him, but it's like a sun with a serpent around it, which represents the idea of bestowing virtues, like the sun is bestowing light on other people, and then wisdom with the serpent, hearkening back to the Old Testament with Adam and Eve, and also what I read about serpent imagery in Manly P. Hall's The Secret Teachings of All Ages. I'll make an entire different video about that at some point. So a lot of what makes the book tick is really potent symbolism like that, and some of it he explains pretty explicitly. Like it's not my interpretation that the sun represents bestowal. That's actually what he talks about in the book. Likewise with the serpent. And then same thing when he's talking about like the child and the lion and all of these different images that represent these stages of self-overcoming in order to use your will to power to aspire to be the Übermensch. He tells you like what he's going for, you know, but then other stuff, different biblical references, other symbols he uses in the book, you're kind of left to your own devices to interpret. So I would say I got tired of a lot of his speeches, which is funny to say about a book called Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's aptly titled. It's a ton of speeches, especially in parts two and three. But then by part four, it got a lot more scenic, a lot more symbolic, a lot more fictional again. And not fictional as in fake, but it's just like appealing to those conventions rather than him just espousing his ideals at you. So I definitely started to feel the drag a bit until it got more scenic. But then um, anytime that I started to get confused, and I was like, maybe this actually is one of his hardest books and I don't understand it, I kept just being reminded that it's like he is using a lot of different ways and different scenes and different speeches to lead to just a handful of ideas about resisting inherited morality, not being lazy and weak, resisting pity as is valued in the Christian religion in order to value strength and self overcoming. Um, and so I think that if you familiarize yourself with those basic concepts, the areas where it feels like he's going into a strange territory, a lot of it is like, oh, he just found like another way to support this idea of those basic ideas that he was talking about, you know? And maybe too, just after reading so much postmodernism, I started to worry. It's like, oh, is he just going into some crazy direction that is just going to be a fragment? But what's nice about this is anytime it starts to feel fragmentary, I'm like, oh no, this is like a work of modernism. I think that's the correct category to put this in. And so it's like, it's all leading back to his central thesis about being an overman, even if it gets occasionally unclear about how that would actually manifest in the real world, or if you were to follow his ideas. So in section four, what I found so cool and something that I've wanted to try in my writing now that I've read this is that he talks about the superior humans, and he uses superior ironically because they're groups of people that would traditionally be considered superior either by other people or by society, but they actually fall short of becoming the overmen. Like a lot of them have actually dismantled their traditional inherited morality. They've dismantled their obedience to God, but then they're either nihilistic or resting on their laurels in the case of the kings, and they don't really achieve that vision of like strength and self-overcoming that Nietzsche values so much. And so that was cool because it was a very fictional and literary way of describing the pitfalls of following this path. But then also, this is what made me become more critical of this idea because it seems almost as if maybe, I can't read Nietzsche's mind, but maybe he was understanding or confronting the idea that like this might just be an ideal, the overman, the overhuman, the Ubermensch. And even though he has a bunch of answers to all of the objections I'm going to make, it just seems like what would the likelihood be that you would dismantle all your inherited structures from what came before, all obedience to God, whether it's the traditional God or the idols that are erected by society, and then come out the other side as this brilliantly strong person who's incorporated your shadow, who not only laughs but embodies strength and laughing in the face of danger. Brief aside, one of the coolest images in the book is a I think it's a vision that he has of this guy who's like asleep and a snake has crawled into his mouth. And the guy has the wherewithal to wake up and bite off the snake's head and just like relish and laugh at what he's done, which I interpret as a willingness to just sink into the deepest, darkest depths of yourself and then come out the other side victorious. So to me, it's like, what's the likelihood that you would turn into that and not have the absence of all of these traditional structures just destroy you, or at least just make you nihilistic and depressed, at least partially? You know, I think it would be unlikely. Um, but again, the Nietzsche scholars could probably give me both satisfying and pedantic answers to that. I think just on a personal level, I don't think you should fully embrace this idea of striving for the overman. It can be a tool in your toolbox. It is very cool and very inspiring, but it also just seems like it could just be another god that you're worshiping, another ideal that you're striving toward. And he has an answer for this as well, of course, because he's a brilliant writer, where I'm going to see if I can pull up the quote. He talks about how if you make an idol or a god out of him, it is the wrong thing to do. Let me find this really quick. He's saying, oh no, where to go? Oh, here we go. It's on page 68 of my edition. You revere me, but what if your reverence should someday collapse? Be careful lest a statue fall and kill you. Just metal as hell. Excellent. So, I mean, he obviously understood the objections to this kind of stuff. It makes me wonder, too. It's like, was he this guy? He was kind of a recluse. Or was this just an ideal of his? You know, I don't know a whole lot about his biography. But let me shift gears for a second. Some of the stuff in here reminds me a whole lot of not only what I've read about in the German tradition, but in occultism. This preference for will rather than obedience, and self-assertion and self-overcoming. And so in his idea of eternal recurrence, which seems like nobody agrees on what that is, I first encountered it in a YouTube clip from a podcast where people seemed pretty convinced that eternal recurrence was his assertion that the universe has all like happened before and that time is circular. I also read in the footnotes, I think it was of this or maybe it was something I read online, that he tried to work this out in his like private notes, but it was very sketchy and was not like a completed work of his. I've also heard people interpret it, which I lean more toward this interpretation, that eternal recurrence is more about the continual will to power that allows you to keep overcoming yourself and keep striving to become the overhuman. That like anytime you've reached a new plateau, you just have to like descend into the depths again and reincorporate all those negative aspects of yourself and then rise again, you know. That's what I see eternal recurrence as. I've seen some support of that online. But again, it's not an idea that he fleshes out very specifically in here, even though he talks about it a lot. This is one of those more literary aspects of the book that's more open to interpretation, that in the Drunken Song, which is in one of the last sections, I think it's called the Drunken Song, something drunken, where he invites all of the superior humans into his cave and is kind of disappointed with the way that they've misinterpreted his ideas and everything like that. He's basically saying that you should be in love with eternity and in love with this endless process. That's a huge digression. Yeah, the Drunken Song. There you go. To me, it reminds me of alchemy. It reminds me of the idea that you need to sort of burn and destroy yourself in order to transform yourself and become anew. And this leads me back to what I was talking about at the beginning of the video about spirituality, is that it can seem very abstract, especially if you're to believe that Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence is a claim about metaphysics. It can seem a little woo-woo. It can seem a little spiritual and religious even, which seems to contradict a lot of what he would say. But in my opinion, this whole idea of transformation, overcoming yourself, and rising from the ashes, becoming the overhuman, if it's not just an ideal, if it is real, what it means is that in order to transform yourself, it's just becoming more of what you already are. And I think this is what has struck me so much about this book and made it such an excellent investigation for this trip that I've been on at this stage in my life, is that spirituality and transformation is not turning into something else. It's not dissolving your ego or somehow reaching the astral plane. It is an increasing awareness of what you already are. And that is the most charitable interpretation that I can give to either eternal recurrence or Nietzsche's ideas in general in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Even to say charitable makes it sound like I'm implying that there's this like very negative reading of this. Like when I visited the Nietzsche archive in Weimar, I left completely convinced that the fascists that have taken his ideas for their own purposes one, did not read his work. They just liked his political influence. And two, completely contradict a lot of what he was going for. He argued against the state. He argued against people that love having power over other people. And so it just seems baffling to me that he would look at identitarians who think that they're excellent by dint of race or cultural group as his overhuman. That's exactly what he was against, was the herd mentality. And I just don't think he would respect anyone at all who thought they were excellent just because they were born a certain way. Completely flies in the face of all of this. There is some stuff to be criticized too about his worldview, that some of it is misogynist. He doesn't talk a lot about women in the book, but I remember in Beyond Good and Evil too, he was talking a lot about just the essential nature of women. I think that would raise quite a few eyebrows at the very least to either women readers or just anyone reading it today. That part feels a little dated, but on the whole, I would recommend the book. Like I said, if it's the first thing you've ever read by Nietzsche, you might want to do a little pre-reading. Check out Damien by Hermann Hesse. Check out a little bit about the German tradition, about the will to power. Quick Google search for some of these concepts I think will set you up pretty well. But, if you've read a lot of the books I've talked about on this channel, I think that it won't be that bad of a challenge for you. Anyway, guys, my trip is still going on for 2 weeks. It's insane how long this trip has been. It's had seasons unto itself. And it's been nice to have a little bit of downtime in a smaller city in order to just blast through this book. I read it a lot more quickly than I usually read a book. So hope you guys got something out of this. Please let me know if you've got any comments, questions, or criticisms. I may or may not answer them. Peace.